Everyone, I'm Christian. In this tutorial, I will show you how to get started with the Vegetation Engine. Please keep in mind that the Vegetation Engine is quite a big asset, and in this tutorial, we will cover only the basics. So once the asset is imported, the Vegetation Engine hub will appear. All you need to do is to install the asset. It will set up a few things. And once this is done, you will need to choose the render pipeline used in your project. In my case, I'm using HDRP with the latest LTS Unity version. So I will choose high definition 10 and import the package. Once this is done, all you need to do is to finish the setup and we are all set. Once everything is imported, let's go ahead and open the learn scene from the assets, Voxophobic, the Vegetation Engine learned folder. And as you can see, there are a few prefabs in here. We will convert these prefabs to work with the Vegetation Engine. But before we do that, we need to add the Vegetation Engine Manager in the scene. To do that, go to the hierarchy, right click, go to Voxophobic, the Vegetation Engine, and choose the manager. The manager is responsible for sending global data to the shaders, and it is split in 4 categories. The global motion will send motion data to the shaders. The global details is usable with the terrain details module. The global control will send shading data to the shaders, and the global volume will render the elements, but we will see more about that a bit later. To make these presets compatible with the Vegetation Engine, we will need to convert them using the Prefab Converter. Let's open up the Prefab Converter from Window, Voxophobic, the Vegetation Engine, Prefab Converter. The Prefab Converter will usually convert your assets with one click, and the conversion goes like this. You need to select the preset, the prefab, and as you can see, it is automatically detected in the converter. We can go ahead and select multiple prefabs, and all of them will be detected. And if these prefabs are part of an asset supported by the Vegetation Engine, you will need to go and choose the conversion preset from that asset. If the source is unknown and the assets are using the Unity default shaders or some custom shaders, you can go and choose or try the automatic presets. They are not guaranteed to work, but in most cases they work with some extra work. For some of the newer assets supported in the Vegetation Engine, this preset is automatically detected, so all you need to do is to select the assets and it will be detected, and you just need to press convert, and that's it. Let's go ahead and convert some prefabs. This tree is made with Treat, which is a free software for creating vegetation, and for it there is a preset under Tools, Treat Vegetation. So I just choose the preset and press convert, and as you can see, the asset is converted, and it is now using the Voxophobic shaders. For the leaves, the leaf shader is applied. For the bark shader is applied. Once converted, the Vegetation Engine will create some new assets near the folder and everything is saved as a new file, so you can reuse the assets in other prefabs if needed, and it also keeps a backup, so you can always revert the assets if needed. Okay, so I will convert again, and for the grass assets, I will select all of them at once, and the prefab converter will only select the root of the prefab and not the actual game object. And for the grasses, since the source is unknown, but they use the HDRP lead shader, I will go with the automatic grass preset. And convert again. And as you can see, everything is moving nicely. And for the static props, I will choose the automatic props preset, press convert, and now they will use the Vegetation Engine props shader. Now that everything is converted, let's briefly look at the shaders. I have selected the leaves material, and on the leaves shader, as you can see, there are a lot of settings you can control. I will not cover all these settings today because there are a lot of stuff to cover, but instead I will show you one of the motion settings, which is the bending, which will bend the tree. And I will change the primary bending to something higher. And as you can see, setting the bending for the leaves to something higher, but not for the bark, will disconnect the animation. In order to fix this, you can use the material settings window. The material settings window will detect all the materials on the prefab or on all the selected prefabs, and it allows you to set the same settings for all the materials at once. So in this case, because I changed the primary bending for the leaves material, but not for the bark, the primary bending will show a mixed value. So in order to fix it, I just go and change the value, and once this is changed, it will assign the same value for all the materials selected in the material settings window. Please keep in mind that you most likely will need to adjust the motion settings and shading settings for all the converted materials, because some assets are converted from a different render pipeline, and some settings don't match 100%, or some of the settings cannot be transferred to the Vegetation Engine. And for the motion settings, please watch the motion settings tutorial. It covers all the motion settings from materials to converted meshes. Cool stuff. Let's go ahead and transform this scene to a snowy environment, and after that let's control the seasons. If you go to the global control, you will see some global settings. In here you can control, for instance, the alpha, which will control the leaves amount in the scene, or the wetness, which will increase the smoothness on all the vegetation, and we have the global overlay. The global overlay is used to add snow or a fine sand on the vegetation, but it is mostly used for snow. And let's go and set the global overlay to 1. And as you can see, uh, we added some snow to the scene, but some assets are more affected than the others. For instance, there is barely any snow on the grass, but there is a lot on the tree. If you select the materials, you will see that we have the same global settings on the materials. And here we can control if any of these materials should receive those global settings, and we can control how much the snow is affecting uh, those materials. For instance, in this case, you might need to adjust the overlay mask to have more or less snow. Same for the grass. I will adjust the overlay mask to add some more snow and maybe also add some variation. If we go back to the global control, you will see a season control slider, and right now it is set to summer, and if I change the slider, nothing is happening. That's because the season control is used to control the elements, and it is not affecting the global settings. The elements are decal-like objects used to control the global settings locally on the vegetation or on the props prefabs. And let's recreate the same effect with the overlay, but instead of using the global overlay, let's use some elements. Create an element, go to the hierarchy, right click, go to box of all, the Vegetation Engine, and choose an element. And the element is created, and by default, the element is set to a color element. A color element will color the vegetation, and you can already see the vegetation colored by this element. If I duplicate, let's disable the overlay. If I duplicate this element and set it to a different color, the vegetation is affected in that area. So let's recreate the snow effect using the elements. I will delete one of the elements and make this one quite big and move it under the ground. The elements are rendered by the global volume, and you always need to make sure that the global volume, the elements are located inside the global volume. If I go to the gizmos and enable the gizmos, as you can see, there is a big volume, and the element is inside the volume, so it will be rendered by this global volume. If the element is outside the global volume, you will see a red blinking gizmo, meaning the element is not rendered. So if you ever have issues with elements not rendering, just go to the gizmos and enable them. And if you see the red gizmo, it means your global volume is not in the right place. You can set this volume higher or bigger or smaller based on your scene, you will need to match it with your scene, and you can change the resolution for the render textures created for these elements. The global volume and all the elements will be covered in another video in greater detail. So for now, to keep things simple, I will move back the element to my scene, and everything is affected by this element. So instead of using a color element, I will go to Voxophobic, the Vegetation Engine elements, default, and choose the extras overlay element. And since the value is set to 1, everything is affected by snow, and by changing the slider, you can control the snow amount. In order to change the element based on this season control, you need to go to the element and change the element mode from constant to seasons. And now we have a value for each season. So for the winter, we will leave the value to 1, and for the rest of the seasons, we will set it to 0. And now if you go back to the global control and move the slider, once we go to winter, the scene is affected by that element. The nice part about the elements is that you can create masks for different regions to not be affected, for instance, by the snow. If I set it back to constant and scale it down, I can remove the snow in this area. All right, and let's color the vegetation based on seasons. I will rename these elements. This will be the snow element. I will remove this one, the mask, duplicate this one, and this will be a color element used to color the vegetation. I will go back to setting the colors default shader, and now that it is set to seasons, we can change the colors for each season. For winter, for instance, I will go with maybe some dark brown. For the spring, I will go with some light green. We will need to adjust these colors a bit later. For the summer, I will leave it to gray, but I will set the alpha to 0 so it won't affect the materials at all. And for autumn, I will set it to something more orange. And let's see how they look. Yeah, for the spring, I will reduce the influence a bit. For the summer, the element is not affecting the materials at all. For autumn, it is a bit too colored. Maybe let's set it to something like this. And with two elements, we created a nice season transition. So the nice part about the elements is that you can control the assets locally, and you can use layers to affect different materials with different elements. But before we go and use any of these layers, let's go to the materials and look actually to the elements and look at the elements categories, because this will be needed to understand how to set the layers on the materials. So if we go to the core elements shaders, you will see that the shaders are the elements are split in 4 categories. We have the color elements, we have the extras elements, we have the motion elements, and we have the vertex elements. And if you go to any of the materials, on the global settings, you will see that we have the same layers for the materials. So, for instance, if I duplicate this element, which is a color element, and if I want to change the leaves on the tree to yellow, for instance, on autumn, we can go ahead and change it to yellow and set the render layer to 1 and disable the default one. And now, if I go back to the control and go to autumn, if I go to the the leaves material, I can see that the layer is set to default, so it will be affected by this element. If I change the layer to layer 1, now only this material is affected by this element. So now if I go back to the control and control the seasons, that material will be affected by this element over here. One thing to keep in mind is that by using more layers on the elements, more render textures will be created using more memory. Next, let's create a basic interaction element. I will go again to the hierarchy, voxelphobic, the vegetation engine, and create a new element. And for this one, I will change the shader to elements, motion, interaction. And this element will create a basic interaction, and it will push the grass in the element texture direction, which is similar to a normal map. But if I move the element up or down, as you can see, nothing is happening. That's because the elements are rendered by the global volume from top down, and there is no depth perception between the elements and the vegetation. But what you can do is to enable the Raycast fading, which will send the ray from the element to the colliders. And for instance, you can set the layer for your terrain to a custom layer. Go to the element, set the Raycast layer to the same layer, and the element will check against that layer. And if I set the Raycast distance to, let's say, 2, now if I move the element up or down, the vegetation is affected based on that Raycast distance. To see this effect better, I will go to the global volume and set the element's visibility to always hidden. And now if I move it up or down, the element will affect the vegetation only when it reaches that distance. If you need some more advanced interaction, the elements can be used with particles, and there are a few examples included in the Vegetation Engine demo elements folder. Let's take a look at the particle motion interaction dynamic prefab. If I move it around, the grass is swaying in the movement direction. But you will notice some lighting artifacts. These are happening because the mesh normals are not changing with the bending. To fix this issue, we can reconvert these meshes with the normals pointing up to give the grass a more flat look. And I will open the converter again, and you can change the normals to flat shading in the advanced settings under the mesh settings, normal source. But an easier way to do it is to simply go to the conversion override and go to the normals and make the normals flat and convert again. But with it, we need to change the render normals to same. So the front faces and the back faces are all lit the same. And I will reduce the smoothness because it is a bit too high. All right, and now the shading looks much better. The second prefab I want to show you is the particle motion interaction train. This will push the grass in the particle movement direction, and the grass will remain bent until the particles are faded out. To control how fast this fading is happening, you can go to the particle interaction element and change the particle lifetime to something smaller. In this case, I will set it to 2 seconds, and now if I move the interaction, the grass is bending up in 2 seconds. For more examples using the elements, please check the demo scenes. There are quite a few included, and there are some nice effects you can achieve with elements and with particles combined with elements. The last thing I want to show you about the elements is how they are rendered inside the global volume. If I scale this element up, once it reaches the volume edge, it will be stretched outside the global volume. This is by design because you might want to have elements that go outside the volume, and they will affect everything else that is outside the volume. If you want elements that are faded at the volume edge, you can enable the volume edge fading, and now the element is faded at the edge volume. You can control this fading about on the global volume, elements, edge fading. Now, my volume is quite small. Let's say we have a big terrain, a 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers terrain. Let's set the volumes to 10 kilometers. And once I set it, as you can see, the element rendering resolution is quite small. One way to fix it is to set the global volume, the rendering mode inside the global volume to a higher resolution. But keep in mind that setting it to a higher resolution will use more memory. So instead, we can set the volume to follow the main camera. And if I set it, for instance, follow main camera at 1K resolution, now this element is rendered in way better resolution than before. And if I select the main camera, the volume for the colors elements rendering is following the main camera, rendering everything in better resolution. The volume can be offsetted in the camera forward direction, so no elements are rendered behind the camera. This is especially useful for motion interaction elements where you need a better resolution for the elements. For extras and colors elements, having them rendered inside the global volume, it might be fine because you don't really need super high resolution for those elements. And this follow main camera volume can be increased or decreased if needed. The last thing for today, if you are using Nature Renderer, GPU Instancer, Vegetation Studio, you will need to add support to the shaders. And to do it, go to Window, Boxophobic, the Vegetation Engine, Shader Settings, and you can add support for all these renderers for all the shaders at once, or for each shader separately if multiple renderers are used. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions or issues, feel free to join us on Discord. Yeah, thanks for watching.